Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be getting into the fascinating world of behavioral economics
Oh, yeah.
with a book that you've probably heard of. I'm sure most people listening have at least heard of it. Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein.
It's a classic.
Yeah, it really is. It's all about, how these subtle influences, these nudges, can shape our choices in ways we might not even realize.
Like an invisible hand almost, guiding us towards certain decisions.
Yeah, and they give some really compelling examples in the book. Like
Yeah.
you go to a website and you're trying to sign up for something, and the premium option is already pre-selected.
Oh, yeah, that's happened to me so many times.
And most people, I mean myself included, you just kind of click continue without even thinking about it.
Yeah, you just assume that that's the standard option or the recommended choice.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's choice architecture at work.
Yeah, that's a great example of how these little things can have a big impact on our decisions.
So Thaler and Sunstein, they use this term libertarian paternalism to describe their approach, and it sounds a bit like an oxymoron, right?
It does. How can you be libertarian and paternalistic at the same time?
Yeah, it's like those two ideas are kind of at odds with each other.
Yeah, but it's actually a pretty simple idea when you break it down.
Okay, so how would you explain libertarian paternalism?
Well, it's about designing systems that encourage people to make choices that are in their best interest, but without actually restricting their freedom to choose.
Okay, so it's not about forcing people to do anything.
No, not at all. It's more about nudging them in the right direction.
I see. Like giving them a little push towards the better option.
Exactly. They use the example of a school cafeteria. You want kids to eat healthier, but you don't want to ban junk food altogether.
Right, because that would probably backfire.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So instead, you make those healthier choices more prominent. You put the fruit at eye level, you make the salad bar more appealing. You're not forcing anyone to eat anything, but you're making it easier for them to make the healthier choice.
So it's like giving the apple a prime spot on the shelf.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
But to really understand how these nudges work, I think we have to understand how people actually make decisions.
Right, because traditional economics assumes that we're all these perfectly rational beings, weighing costs and benefits, maximizing our utility.
Like little robots calculating the optimal outcome.
Yeah, exactly. But behavioral economics tells a different story. We're not always so rational.
Yeah, we have biases, we make mistakes,
Yeah,
and we're easily influenced by things we might not even be aware of.
absolutely.
Okay.
And that's where the concept of nudging comes in.
So it's more about how we actually behave, not just how we think we should behave.
Exactly. And that's what makes this book so fascinating. It reveals the hidden forces that shape our choices.
Okay, so let's get into some of these biases. One that really struck me was anchoring.
Oh, anchoring is a classic. It's the idea that we tend to latch on to the first piece of information we get, even if it's completely irrelevant.
Like even if it has nothing to do with the actual decision we're trying to make.
Exactly. They give this great example. Imagine you're trying to guess the population of Milwaukee.
Okay.
And I first ask you if it's bigger or smaller than 2 million.
Okay.
Your guess is probably going to be anchored to that number, even though I just pulled it out of thin air.
That's so weird.
I mean,
But I can see how that would happen. It's like our brains get fixated on that first number, even if it has nothing to do with the actual answer.
exactly. And it can have a real impact on our decisions, especially when we're dealing with things like prices or negotiations.
So it's like a mental shortcut that our brains take, but it doesn't always lead us to the best outcome.
Right. And speaking of mental shortcuts, what about the availability heuristic?
Oh, yeah. That one's all about how easily we can recall examples of something, right?
Exactly. And it explains why people are more afraid of flying after a plane crash, even though statistically it's still safer than driving.
It's like our brains are saying, well, if I can easily remember it, it must be more likely to happen.
Yeah. And it's not just about dramatic events like plane crashes. It can also affect our everyday decisions.
Okay, like how?
Well, let's say you're trying to decide whether to invest in a certain stock. If you can easily recall stories of people who made a lot of money investing in that stock, you might be more likely to invest yourself, even if the underlying fundamentals of the company aren't that strong.
So it's like our memories are shaping our perceptions of risk and reward.
Exactly. And it's important to be aware of this bias because it can lead us to make decisions that aren't in our best interest.
This is making me question everything I thought I knew about making rational decisions.
Well, that's the beauty of behavioral economics. It reveals these hidden forces that are shaping our choices. And once you understand those forces, you can start to use them to your advantage.
Okay, so let's talk about how we can use these insights to actually make better decisions. What are some of the key takeaways from Nudge?
Well, one of the most powerful nudges they talk about is the power of defaults.
Defaults, like the settings that are already chosen for it.
Exactly. And they tap into our inertia or a tendency to stick with the status quo.
Okay.
Like how? Well, think about organ donation countries with opt-out systems where you have to actively choose not to be a donor, have much higher donation rates than countries with opt-in systems.
That's interesting. So it's like the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Most people aren't going to go out of their way to change the default option, even if it's something as important as organ donation.
Exactly. And it's not just about being lazy. It's also about the power of suggestion.
Okay.
How so? Well, the default option is presented as the normal or recommended choice. And we tend to trust those suggestions even if we haven't consciously considered the alternatives.
So the way choices are presented really does matter. It's not just about the options themselves, it's about the context in which they're presented.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important nudge, framing effects.
Framing effects, what are those?
It's the idea that the way information is framed can have a huge impact on our decisions.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine you're a doctor and you need to convince a patient to get a tetanus shot. You could say, getting the shot is 90% effective at preventing tetanus. Or you could say, not getting the shot increases your risk of tetanus by tenfold.
Wow, the second framing sounds way scarier, even though it's conveying the same information.
Exactly, and that's the power of framing. We're more sensitive to losses than gains, so highlighting the potential negative consequences is often more effective than emphasizing the potential benefits.
So it's all about finding the right angle, the right way to present the information to get the desired outcome.
And that's where things can get a little bit tricky, because like we said earlier, these nudges can be used for both good and not so good purposes.
Yeah, feels like there's a lot of potential for manipulation here.
There is, but the key, as Thaler and Sunstein emphasize, is to use these nudges ethically with transparency and respect for individual autonomy.
So it's giving people a nudge in the right direction, not manipulating them into making choices they wouldn't otherwise make.
Exactly, and that's the challenge of choice architecture, finding that sweet spot between nudging and freedom of choice.
Okay, so we've talked about anchoring availability, defaults, and framing. Are there any other key biases or nudges that we should be aware of?
Well, one that we haven't mentioned yet but is super important is social influence.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. I mean, we're social creatures. We want to fit in. We want to do what everyone else is doing.
Exactly, and Thaler and Sunstein talk about this spotlight effect. It's that feeling that everyone's watching us, judging our every move.
Which, of course, isn't really true.
Right, but it feels true. And that feeling can be a powerful motivator.
So we're more likely to conform to social norms, even if those norms aren't necessarily rational or in our best interest.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, monkey see, monkey do. We see what others are doing and we assume it must be the right thing to do, even if we don't stop to think about it.
So all these nudges anchoring availability defaults, framing social influence. It feels like our brains are constantly being bombarded by these subtle influences shaping our decisions without us even realizing it.
That's right. Choice architecture is all around us, constantly influencing our behavior. And the more we understand about it, the more we can take control of our decisions and create environments that nudge ourselves and others towards better choices.
Okay, so it's not just about being aware of these nudges. It's also about using them to our advantage to make better choices for ourselves and for society as a whole.
Exactly. That's the power of nudge. It gives us the tools to understand and influence our own decision-making and to create a world where it's easier to make good choices and harder to make bad ones.
I like that. Easier to make good choices and harder to make bad ones. So how do these nudges play out in bigger, more complex systems like saving for retirement or choosing a healthcare plan? We'll dive into those topics and more when we come back after the break.
Okay, so we've seen how these nudges work on an individual level, but how do they play out in bigger, more complex systems, like saving for retirement? That's a decision that a lot of people struggle with. Yeah, it's a big one. And it's an area where choice architecture can make a huge difference. One of the biggest challenges with retirement savings is inertia. People put it off. They think they'll start saving later.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that myself.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, I'll start saving next year.
But the good news is that a simple nudge can help overcome that inertia. Think about automatic enrollment in 401k plans.
Okay.
When people have to actively opt out of saving rather than opt-in participation rates skyrocket it.
That's interesting. So it's like we were saying earlier about defaults.
Yeah.
We tend to stick with whatever's already chosen for us.
Exactly. And it's not just about inertia. Automatic enrollment also takes advantage of something called loss aversion.
Loss aversion.
Yeah, it's the idea that we hate losing things more than we like gaining things.
Okay, I can see that.
So if you're already enrolled in a 401k and you're automatically contributing a certain percentage of your paycheck, it feels like a loss to reduce that contribution, even if it means having a little more money in your pocket today.
Yeah, I guess it does make sense. It's like you're already accustomed to having that money taken out, so it feels weird to change it.
Exactly. So by framing the decision in terms of a potential loss, automatic enrollment makes it more likely that people will stick with the default and save for their future.
And once people are saving, are there other nudges that can help them save even more?
Absolutely. One clever approach is the Save More Tomorrow program.
Save more tomorrow. Okay, what's that?
It's based on the idea that people are more willing to commit to saving in the future than they are today.
I can definitely relate to that. It's like, sure, I can save more money that next year.
Exactly. So the program encourages people to commit to increasing their savings rate every time they get a raise.
So it's like a built-in escalation clause for your savings plan. I like it.
And it works. Studies have shown that people who participate in Save More Tomorrow programs end up saving significantly more than those who don't.
That's impressive. So it's really just about finding the right way to frame the decision and to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing.
Exactly. And that's where choice architecture comes in.
Okay, so we've tackled saving,
Hmm.
but what about investing? That's a whole other level of complexity.
It is. And it's an area where people's biases can really trip them up. One common mistake is what Thaler and Sunstein call naive diversification.
Naive diversification. What does that mean?
It's the tendency to spread your investments equally across all the available options without really considering what those options are or how they fit together.
So it's like ordering a pizza with every topping just to make sure you get a taste of everything, even if some of those combinations might not be so great.
Exactly. And it can lead to portfolios that are poorly balanced and don't align with the investor's risk tolerance or financial goals.
So how do you nudge people towards a more sensible approach to investing?
Well, one way is to simplify the choices. Instead of overwhelming people with hundreds of different investment options, offer them a smaller, curated selection of diversified portfolios tailored to different risk profiles.
So it's like having a personal shopper for your investments.
In a way, yes. And another important nudge is to provide people with clear and concise information about the risks and potential returns of different investments.
Because let's be honest, most people's eyes glaze over when they see a page full of financial jargon.
Absolutely. And that's where the RCAP program we talked about earlier could really come in handy.
Our recap. Remind me how that works.
It would require financial institutions to provide investors with a clear and standardized summary of the fees, expenses, and potential risks associated with different investment products.
So it's like having a nutritional label for your investments.
Exactly. You can see exactly what you're getting into. And it would make it much easier to compare different investment options and avoid those hidden fees that can eat away at your returns.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, especially for people who aren't as familiar with the ins and outs of investing.
Exactly. It would level the playing field and empower investors to make more informed choices.
Okay, so we've covered saving and investing, but what about the other side of the financial coin, borrowing?
Borrowing is another area where nudges can play a crucial role, especially when it comes to mortgages.
Because let's face it, choosing a mortgage is one of the most complex and consequential financial decisions most people will ever make.
Absolutely. And it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the different options, interest rates, and fees. That's where a well-designed choice architecture can make a huge difference.
So how can we nudge people towards making smarter mortgage choices?
Well, for starters, we need to make the process more transparent. Remember RCAP.
Yeah.
That same principle could be applied to mortgages.
So lenders would have to provide borrowers with a clear and standardized summary of all the costs associated with a mortgage, including interest rates, fees, and potential future payment increases.
Exactly. It would be like having a nutritional label for your mortgage so you could see exactly what you're getting into.
That would be so helpful. I wish RICAP existed when I got my mortgage.
Well, it's an idea that's gaining traction. And it's a great example of how nudges can be used to protect consumers and promote financial well-being.
Speaking of promoting well-being, what about nudges in the realm of health? We talked a bit about Medicare Part D earlier, but I'm curious to explore other ways that nudges can be used to improve people's health outcomes.
That's a great question. And it's an area where there's a lot of potential for positive impact. One promising approach is the use of nudges to encourage healthy behaviors.
Like eating better, exercising more, and quitting smoking.
Exactly. Traditional public health campaigns often rely on information and education, but we know that knowledge alone isn't always enough to change behavior. Nudges offer a different way to influence choices by making healthy options easier and more appealing.
So it's about removing those little barriers that can get in the way of good intentions.
Precisely. For example, one study found that simply rearranging the food in a cafeteria so that healthier options were more prominent led to a significant increase in the consumption of fruits and vegetables.
So it's like giving those apples the prime real estate in the lunch line.
Exactly. And another study found that people were more likely to choose healthy snacks if they were placed in a clear container rather than hidden away in a drawer. It's all about making healthy choices more visible and accessible.
Makes sense. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. But what about those who already have unhealthy habits? How can we nudge them towards making positive changes?
Well, one effective approach is the use of commitment devices.
Commitment devices.
Yeah, these are strategies that help people make binding commitments to change their behavior.
Like setting a quit date for smoking or joining a weight loss program.
Exactly. And these commitments can be made even more powerful by adding social pressure or financial incentives. For example, someone who wants to quit smoking could make a bet with a friend where they have to pay up if they light up. Or they could join a program where they deposit money into an account that they only get back if they successfully quit smoking.
So it's about putting some skin in the game, right?
Yeah.
Making it more costly to stick with the bad habit.
Precisely. And these types of nudges can be particularly helpful for people who struggle with self-control or need an extra push to overcome their bad habits.
It's about creating a system of support and accountability. And speaking of systems, let's talk about organ donation again. We touched on the power of defaults earlier, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on other nudges that could encourage more people to become donors.
It's a great topic, and one where nudges can literally save lives. Beyond switching to opt-out systems, there are other strategies that can make a difference. For example, some states have implemented first-person consent registries.
First-person consent registries, what are those?
They allow people to register their decision to be a donor online, making it easier for their wishes to be honored, even if their family members have different views.
That makes sense. It takes away the uncertainty and ensures that people's intentions are carried out.
Exactly. And another approach is to frame the decision in a way that resonates with people's values. For example, some campaigns emphasize the legacy that donors leave behind the lives they touch, even after they're gone.
So it's about appealing to people's sense of altruism and making them feel good about making a difference.
Precisely. And research has shown that framing organ donation in this way can lead to a significant increase in registration rates.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here: saving, investing, borrowing health, and even organ donation. It's clear that nudges can be applied in so many different areas of life.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most exciting things about this field is the potential for innovation. There are always new and creative ways to design nudges that can help people make better choices and achieve their goals.
But before we get too carried away with the possibilities, let's address the potential downsides. Some people might be concerned that nudging is a form of manipulation or that it infringes on individual freedom.
Those are valid concerns, and it's important to be thoughtful about how we design and implement nudges. The key, as Thaler and Sunstein emphasize, is to use them ethically with transparency and respect for individual autonomy. Nudges should always be easy to opt out of, and people should be aware of how they're being nudged.
So it's about giving people a gentle push in the right direction, not forcing them down a predetermined path.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that choice architecture is unavoidable. Someone is always designing the environment in which we make choices. The question is whether that design will be thoughtful and informed by behavioral economics, or whether it will be left to chance or, worse, used to exploit our biases.
So it's not a question of whether or not to nudge, but rather how to nudge responsibly and ethically.
Exactly. And that's where transparency and accountability are crucial. Choice architects need to be open about their goals and methods, and they should be held accountable for the consequences of their nudges. And ultimately, it's up to individuals to be aware of the nudges around them and to make their own choices informed by a better understanding of how their brains work.
Well said. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Uh-huh.
I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new light, noticing all these nudges that I never paid attention to before.
I'm glad to hear that. That's the first step towards taking control of our decisions and creating a world where it's easier to make good choices and harder to make bad ones.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into nudge.
It's been quite a journey, exploring how these subtle influences shape our choices.
Absolutely. We've talked about saving, investing, healthcare, organ donation. It seems like these nudges are everywhere.
They really are. It's amazing how much of our decision-making is influenced by factors that we're not even aware of.
And as we've discussed this choice architecture, the way choices are presented isn't inherently good or bad. It's all about how it's used.
Exactly. A nudge can be a powerful tool for good, helping people make choices that align with their goals and values. But it can also be used to manipulate people and steer them toward choices that benefit someone
Right,
else.
like that pre-selected premium option we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So it's really important to be aware of these nudges and to understand how they're influencing our decisions.
Okay, so how can we make sure that nudges are being used ethically? What are some of the guidelines for good nudging?
Well, Thaler and Sunstein, they outline a few key principles. First and foremost, nudges should be transparent.
Transparent meaning.
People should be aware of how their choices are being influenced. They shouldn't feel like they're being tricked or manipulated.
So no hidden agendas or subliminal messaging.
Exactly. Second, nudges should be easy to opt out of.
So if you don't like the way a choice is being presented, you should be able to easily choose a different option.
Exactly. There shouldn't be any significant cost or hassle involved in going against the nudge.
Makes sense? What else?
Third, nudges should be designed to promote people's well-being as judged by themselves, not by some external authority.
Okay. So it's about respecting people's autonomy and their ability to make their own choices, even if those choices aren't always the most rational from an outsider's perspective.
Exactly. And finally, choice architects should be accountable for the consequences of their nudges.
So if a nudge is having unintended negative consequences, it should be reevaluated and maybe even redesigned.
Exactly. It's not enough to have good intentions. You have to be willing to take responsibility for the outcomes.
I think those are all really important points. But I'm sure there are still some people out there who are skeptical of this whole idea of libertarian paternalism.
Oh, absolutely. There are always going to be people who are uncomfortable with the idea of any kind of government intervention in our choices.
So what are some of the common objections that Thaler and Sunstein address in Nudge?
Well, one concern is that it's a slippery slope. Once we start nudging people in one area, where do we draw the line? Could this lead to more intrusive forms of government control?
It's the classic give them an inch, they'll take a mile argument.
Exactly. But Thaler and Sunstein argue that libertarian paternalism is about preserving freedom of choice. It's not about dictating people's lives. It's about making it easier for them to make choices that align with their own goals and values.
So it's a matter of finding the right balance between nudging and freedom.
Exactly. And another objection is that choice architects might not always have people's best interests at heart. They might be biased, self-serving, or simply incompetent.
So who nudges the nudgers?
That's a great question. And that's why transparency and accountability are so crucial. The goals and methods of choice architecture should be open to public scrutiny, and choice architects should be held responsible for the consequences of their nudges.
It seems like nudging, like any powerful tool, can be used for good or for ill. It all comes down to the intentions and ethics of the people designing those nudges.
That's a great way to put it. We need to be vigilant about the potential for nudges to be used manipulatively, but we shouldn't shy away from their potential to improve our lives and the world around us.
I think this deep dive into nudge has been incredibly eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's really made me think about the subtle ways our choices are being influenced all the time.
Me too. It's fascinating stuff, and it's really empowering to understand these principles because it gives us more control over our own decision-making.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the world of behavioral economics. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in to the deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of nudge as thought-provoking as we did.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those nudges in mind, and remember the power to choose wisely is in your hands.